This is a tough one, guys. Recently, the Fallout 4 Automatron DLC dropped, and ever since finishing up with it, I've been having some rather mixed thoughts. In my eyes, there are so many things that this DLC did amazingly well, but at the same time, many aspects that were a bit of a letdown. So today, I'm here to share my thoughts in a quick but comprehensive, spoiler-free review of Automatron. Let me start off by giving a rating to this DLC. Now, the way I'm gonna rate this is on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being very poor, 5 being an average Bethesda DLC, and 10 being the best DLC Bethesda has ever put out, which in my opinion is Shivering Isles. My rating for this DLC is a 5.5 out of 10, which is actually not too bad on the scale, since it means the DLC was approximately average. Let's go ahead and start off this review by discussing the enemies introduced in Automatron. In my opinion, the enemies were very well done. There were many different kinds of robots with many different modifications, including scrap bots, tank bots, dual bot, and of course the Robo Brain. By nature, having to fight endless robotic enemies gets repetitive, but I think Bethesda did as good a job as they could mixing things up. Moreover, there were times in this DLC where we got to fight somewhat new human enemies, which wasn't exactly the coolest thing ever, but it was a nice change of pace. The enemies were also very difficult to take down in this DLC, which provided for a good challenge. In fact, I felt as though the quests from this DLC were some of the harder ones I've ever done in Fallout 4, especially in the final fight against the Mechanist. So for the enemies, I give this DLC an 8 out of 10. Next, I want to discuss weapons and armor. Now, unfortunately, there isn't really too much to talk about here, since there weren't an incredible amount of weapons and armor introduced, but what they did introduce was fairly cool. The first new weapon of note is the Protectron's Gaze, which is basically just a laser pistol with a legendary effect, and nothing really to write home about. Next, you've got the Buzzsaw, which is actually pretty fun to play around with, and fairly interesting. The third weapon of interest is the salvaged Assaultron Head, which is a weapon that we saw in the trailer, and to be honest, it's a bit of a disappointment. I mean, don't get me wrong here, the weapon is still kind of cool, but instead of firing a devastating continuous laser beam in the same manner Assaultrons do, it's actually more of a tricked out laser musket. The weapon has to be charged before firing, similar to the musket, and can be charged up to 5 times. Every charge increases the damage of the next shot, which unfortunately is just a glorified normal laser beam. It does have the rather interesting drawback of irradiating the user with each shot, but overall the weapon is a bit less unique than I was hoping for. Finally, you've got the Tesla Rifle, which is basically the lightning chain gun teased by Bethesda in the Automatron trailer. Now, unlike the Assaultron Head, this thing is actually very unique and very cool, so I personally enjoy using it. Even if the sights are kinda clunky and the damage output isn't the most impressive thing in the world. Moving on to armor, 2 of the most interesting pieces in this DLC were the Assaultron and Eyebot helmets, which are basically just Assaultron and Eyebot heads that act as a helmet. I thought these 2 were actually a pretty interesting addition, so they've definitely got my thumbs up. Also of note is the Mechanist's armor, which in my opinion was a bit of a letdown. The armor reduces damage from robots by 15%, and the helmet increases your charisma and intelligence by 1, which are effects that fit in well with the DLC, but I still never really found any reason to use it. At the same time, the damage resistance on it is pretty solid, and it also looks pretty cool, so I suppose it's not that bad overall. Finally, you've got the Tesla Power Armor, which is actually a set of power armor that gives you the added effect of increasing energy weapon damage, and is fairly useful. Overall, the weapons and armor in this DLC weren't necessarily bad, but I wouldn't exactly say they were great either, so I'd give them around a 5 out of 10. The next topic I'd like to discuss is locations and general atmosphere. I personally think the DLC did a phenomenal job with the atmosphere, and the locations it introduced were pretty enjoyable as well. The 2 most notable locations from this DLC are the Fort Hagen Hangar and the Mechanist's Lair. Fort Hagen Hangar is a dungeon that's swarming with raiders and has a couple of interesting twists that make it pretty cool. At the same time, I wouldn't exactly say it's anything to write home about. Similarly, I really enjoyed the Mechanist's Lair and would go so far as to say it's potentially one of my favorite locations in Fallout 4. Without giving away too many spoilers, I thought it had a really unique atmosphere and I enjoyed all parts of it that didn't involve me dying and having to start over. The only real problem I have with the locations in this DLC is that they barely introduced any new ones. The new locations in themselves were good, but there just weren't enough of them. So for locations and general atmosphere, I'm gonna give a 6.5 out of 10. Moving on, I want to discuss what is potentially the most important part of this DLC, and that's the robot building and customization. Look, I really don't have too much to say on this one because quite frankly, it was incredible. The number of customization options you get for your robots is completely off the charts. You can equip tons of different weapons on them, including lightning stun guns, laser weapons, flaming shish kebabs, and I think I even saw a cryo option on the list. You can also modify both the legs and the head of your robot, choosing from Sentry, Protectron, Robobrain, and Assaultron style options. The amount of armor customization is also pretty ridiculous. Really, the only qualm I have here is that you can only have a single robot follower, which is a bit of a letdown since I was hoping they let us have 2 robot followers and perhaps a normal companion as well. Although, in hindsight, that could be a little bit overpowered. Anyways, the point is that robot customization was pretty amazing in Automatron, and I'd rate it around a 9.5 out of 10. Now I want to transition to one of my biggest qualms with the DLC, and that is the quest line. The problem here actually isn't the quests themselves, but rather the lack of number of quests. For me, all the quests in this DLC took me about 2 hours, and playing around with robots occupied my time for about 4. So let's be generous and say I spent a total of 7 hours on the DLC. Is 7 hours of content for $10 really worth it? Well, for this particular DLC, I do think yes, but it's not a resounding yes. Look, one of the biggest issues with this DLC is that there weren't enough quests and there wasn't quite enough content, which was a huge problem I had with the base game of Fallout 4. The primary issue of Fallout 4 remains unaddressed in this DLC, which is a bit disappointing. So the quests get a 4 out of 10 from me. Finally, let's talk about the story and the characters. Now, unfortunately, I can't say too much on this aspect since this is a spoiler-free review, but what I am gonna do is make a couple of vague points to illustrate my qualms with the story. I personally found the plot twist with the Mechanist to be pretty cool, but the Mechanist character was horribly fleshed out and not very well done at all. The way the main conflict was resolved in the good ending seemed to come completely from out of nowhere and wasn't really consistent with the Mechanist's past actions. I guess I just really feel like they could have done a better job fleshing out the Mechanist character. Overall, there was a lot of build-up, but the writing ended up being a bit anticlimactic. One somewhat redeeming quality about the story is that it did have multiple endings, but this in no way made up for the poor writing that was rampant in the story at times. Regarding a couple of the other characters in this DLC, Ada and a certain other sassy Robobrain had tons of potential, but weren't built up as characters all that well either. The storyline of this DLC had a ton of potential, but ended up falling way short at around a 3 out of 10. In the end though, I did enjoy myself quite a bit with this DLC. The robot customization was so cool that I would say it made up for the story and the quest to some extent, which is why overall I regard it as an approximately average DLC at a 5.5 out of 10. Well, alright folks, that is pretty much gonna do it for this video. As always, if you enjoyed, be sure to drop me a like down below and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already for more Fallout 4 content in the future. Also, be sure to let me know your thoughts on the Automatron DLC and give it a rating out of 10 down below. Otherwise, I hope you all have an awesome rest of your day, and I will see you in my next video.